Hey, young scientists, welcome back. This is going to be our last unit of AP Chem, and it's a decidedly shorter one at that. I'm going to try and break this up into three, hopefully relatively short screencasts. In this first one, we're just going to review intermolecular forces. We've already talked about these in class, and you've heard about them in previous courses as well. Just want to make sure that you remember all of the different types and what they do. Remember, intermolecular forces, inter means between, the interstate goes between states. So intermolecular forces are forces between the molecules. So these are separate molecules pushing and pulling on each other. Now, for covalent compounds, we're going to have three types of intermolecular forces. Going from weakest to strongest, we'll have London dispersion forces, dipole-dipole interactions, and hydrogen bonding, which is really just the strongest version of dipole-dipole. So if you want to think about this as two types, then with a sort of special subset you can, or if you want to think about it as three separate things, that's okay too. Now, London dispersion forces are the weakest type of intermolecular force, and every molecule has London dispersion forces. It's just that it's so weak that with polar molecules, it doesn't really matter. Now, anytime you have an atom with electrons around the nucleus, the electron's motion is essentially random, which means sometimes the electrons will all travel in the same direction, and they'll create what we call a temporary dipole, where there's a positive side, this exposed nucleus, and a negative side with these electrons over here. And if I lined up another one of these temporary dipoles, so I had another positive side here, or I had another negative side over here, then we'd have a little bit of attraction. But this attraction would only be for a fraction of a second, and it's not very strong. Now, if we have bigger molecules and bigger atoms, then we have more electrons that can do this, so we have a little bit more force. But London forces are really, really, really weak. A significant step up are dipole-dipole interactions. This is when we have a permanent dipole. We have permanent positive and negative sides because of a difference in electronegativity. As the two sides, the opposites will attract. So if here I have a polar molecule, it'll line up with another one of those polar molecules, and the positive side will attract the next molecule's negative side. Or if you line up the negative sides, you'll have repulsion. Or if you flipped these around and lined up the positive sides, you'll have repulsion. Just like any magnets, this gets weaker with distance. This is dipole-dipole interactions. Di as in two, and pole as in opposite sides. Two opposite sides, positive and negative. A special type of dipole-dipole interactions is hydrogen bonding. It's the exact same thing, but the two atoms in the bond are, one of them is hydrogen, and the other one is either nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. Now, since nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine are very electronegative, that makes the dipole especially strong, which makes the positive more positive and the negative more negative, making the whole thing have stronger dipole-dipole interactions. Hydrogen bonding is what holds water together. Water is made of a lot of H and O bonds. It's also what holds your DNA together. There are OH and NH bonds between the two sides of the double helix, and that's what holds the two sides together in the middle. So hydrogen bonding is really just the strongest version of dipole-dipole interactions. So here's a little flow chart for you to follow to determine the type of intermolecular forces. Now first you're going to ask, is this bonding ionic or covalent? If it's ionic, then there aren't really molecules, so there aren't really intermolecular forces. You'll see some professors describe ionic bonds as another type of IMF that's just the strongest. But since there aren't really molecules, lots of people just don't classify it as IMF. It's just a different kind of force. If it's covalently bonded, you're going to ask yourself, is it polar or is it nonpolar? If it's nonpolar, the only type of IMF are London forces. If it's polar, you want to look for H's bound to N's, O's, or F's. If you have an H to an N, an H to an O, or an H to an F, you'll have some hydrogen bonding. If you don't have one of those three types of bonds, then you'll have dipole-dipole interactions. So ionic bonds don't really have IMF. In covalent bonds, if it's polar, it can either have hydrogen bonding or dipole-dipole interactions. And if it's non-polar, it'll have London dispersion forces. Now, to determine whether or not it's polar, you probably want to sketch a Lewis structure and look for differences, look for asymmetry. To practice with that, go ahead and determine the type of intermolecular forces for H2, hydrogen gas, CO, carbon monoxide, and water. If you were paying attention, you probably will already know the type of intermolecular forces for water. Like I said, this is a shorter video. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next thing, but we're going to do that in a separate video.